pulling some excerpts from, and it's called How the Word is Passed. And How the Word is Passed is a collective history of some slave locations or the different slave plantations, cemeteries where African Americans are buried. And what Clint Smith has attempted to do is basically bring attention to a lot of these things that have helped shape African American history through slavery. One of the places that he looked at is, of course, Monticello and the slave connection with Monticello. He's also talked about the Blanford Cemetery, which is a black cemetery in Petersburg. He talks about the Angola Prison, which is the Louisiana State Penitentiary. And today's piece, which I'll be speaking about, is the Whitney Plantation. I have some PowerPoint slides to share. And I'm going to be very intentional about this today, and I want you to come along with me on this journey, because I want you to feel the same way I felt as I traveled to this space to go. Now, the Whitney Plantation is located in St. John the Baptist Parish in Louisiana. It is about an hour south of New Orleans. And last summer, last August, my girlfriend and I decided to actually go and check out this plantation. All the images that you see here were all taken by me on location at the plantation. So while they're getting that queued up, just envision with me, if you will. We're driving from the city of New Orleans. We're leaving, heading to the Whitney Plantation, which is on the west bank along the Mississippi River. As we drive in, the city of New Orleans is in our rear view mirror, getting smaller and smaller. In order to get over to the West Bank, you have to cross the bridge. This is the same bridge that during Hurricane Katrina, the National Guard troops stood upon to keep people from exiting the city to escape the flooding of New Orleans. It's the same bridge you do have to cross over to get over into the West Bank. So again, I'm just enduring this history and just thinking about the connection that these people had trying to escape from New Orleans to get away. So as we're traveling along the Mississippi River, you look to your left, sugarcane fields, look to your right, sugarcane fields, just rows and rows of sugarcane fields along the Mississippi. You look, you see the levees. Every 10 miles or so, you come across a big plantation house. And this whole area along the way was just plantation manors. Some very, very, very big. Some, the houses look small because they're so far back that you can't see it, but you know that this sits on a lot of land. The Whitney Plantation, again in St. John the Baptist Parish, sits on about 2,000 acres. And I want to open with this. And I'm pulling from Clint Smith's book. Between the wooden white fence and the red brick path where I stood, there was a plot of earth where the dark heads of 55 black men sat on metal stakes. Their heads were balanced on robust silver rods that pushed their necks toward the sky. Their eyes were shut, and some of their faces were contorted as if frozen in a permanent state of anguish. Each jawbone was chiseled as much by indignation as by a tool with someone's hand. Many had thin white bandanas wrapped around their foreheads with small knots lying against their temples. The sunlight glinted, and the ceramic statues created a soft glow. It almost seemed as if their gleaming cheeks were covered in both blood and sweat. We have a little technical difficulty here. Okay, I'll go ahead and move forward a little bit. Again, I said this was August, and you can imagine how hot New Orleans is in August on the Mississippi River. When we arrived to the plantation, it is actually a walking tour, all of it outside on a small percentage of the property. We did not walk the entire property, but it is a museum that was created again to not uh, brag about slavery or talk about slavery, but basically the Whitney Plantation, the reason it is so significant is because it's the only existing slave museum in the United States where they actually have recognized, or they have there we go, where they have a recorded history of the 350 slaves that actually were on location at this particular plantation. They did an excellent job of record keeping. Everybody who came in, who was bought and sold, the records were kept from this particular plantation. Next slide, please. So the first you see, when you exit out of the building itself, you come to the Wall of Honor. And what the Wall of Honor is, it is basically the names of the 350 slaves who were there at the Whitney Plantation. It gives their either date of birth or the date that they arrived, the African nation that they came from, and in some cases, who they were brought from. So again, this is a very detailed history, and all this is imprinted on this black granite. As I walked through and read through the names, again, I'm gonna remind you, it's hot in Louisiana, but the history here really still motivated me to take time to look at every name, every African country that they came from, and make that connection with them. And as I read on, the deep history and legacy of the people that came through the plantation really began to revel and reveal itself. Even the former mayor of New Orleans, Mark Morial, his ancestors came through there. And it is noted, duly noted on the Wall of Honor. Next slide, please. As I move through the next section of the tour, we got to what was called Returning the Chains. And it is a statue, a bust, that probably sits as high as this podium, and it's just a picture of a hand with a chain draped across it, meaning like returning the chains to get out of the bondage of slavery. Near this was another exhibit. Again, I want to really share with you just this well-documented history. A list of, again, those slave names who came through the plantation. For instance, you had Charles from the Mandingo Nation, born around 1764. Sarah, Mandingo Nation, born 1774. Constant, Congo Nation, born 1759. Samba, Poulard Nation, born 1768. Lubin, Ado Nation, born 1767. Euro, Poulard Nation, 1768. In addition to these names, they also have short stories or short descriptions of experiences that slaves went through. Next slide, please. On one of them was a quote by Pauline. And Pauline said, "Who? Us read? If you would have picked up a piece of paper, they would have slapped your head off. I used to deliver notes to their neighbor. They knew we couldn't read. They didn't want us to learn how either. My ma used to jump up and down and say, 'We gwine be free.' But if boss had heard of her saying that, she would have been put in the stocks, her hands, her feet, her head. That would have been her punishment." So as you move through this, you read these stories, and they're so powerful. Another one that I would like to share was written on the wall. It was written by a child, and he said, "My ma had 15 children, and none of them had the same pa. Every time she was sold, she would get another man. My ma had one boy by her master that was his Mrs. Brother's child. So you see, every time she was sold, she had to take another man. Her had 15 children after she was sold the last time." Again, this rich, rich history. Next slide, please. Over the years, the plantation passed through many owners. One of the longest lineage of owners were the Haydels. Haydel. The Haydels had the plantation for 115 years, passed down through the family. Now I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit and tell you how it got the name, the Whitney Plantation. After one of the Haydels was a widower, she later died, and before she died, she sold the property to a gentleman by the name of Bradish Johnson. Bradish Johnson bought the plantation and a one next door to it, and he named the plantations after his daughters. One of his daughters' name was Whitney, the other daughter was Carol. So that is how it got the name, the Whitney Plantation. Bradish brought it from the Haydels. But again, just want to talk about how rich the history was, and this is another one of these granite slabs that basically talks about the auction of slaves, and this comes from the auction of slaves in 1840. Little Gwym, 50 years, African, sold to Mr. Intinte Villare, $170. Paul, 48, from the Congo, sold to Cyprin Tremolay, $300. Maurice, 12 years, Creole, coachman, sold to Nicholas Bertoli, $1,200. Cueto, 28 years, Creole, maimed in one arm, carter and plowman, sold to Widow Choplin, $350. Next slide, please. As you continue to move through the plantation, of course, one of the stops is the big house. And of course, the big house was, as many of us know, the master's house. And I would say by today's standards, it's not very large. I think they said it's about 1,200 square feet. However, the big houses were often painted white, and they sat on the plantation so that when ships sailed up and down the Mississippi River, they could see. That would be the largest structure on the property. So again, basically, they looked at the big house and lots of land, so of course that is how they associated wealth. One interesting fact I did learn that the big houses, there were no kitchens in the big house. All the food in a lot of plantations was cooked off-site and then brought into the house. So I thought that was very unique. And they actually, of course, they did not have refrigerators, but what they did is they dug holes in the ground and stored their food in the floor, in the ground, because the ground was cooler, and that's basically what they used for refrigeration. And as you walked through the big house, you actually saw the holes dug in the floor that served as a refrigerator and the pantry. Next slide, please. After I moved from the big house, again going along the way, you get to the slave quarters. And the slave quarters, of course, they were very meager living accommodations. And I want to read to you a piece from the book as well. The old slave quarters at the Whitney were built from wooden planks laid on top and alongside of one another, each panel shaved from cypress trees that once ornamented the banks of the Mississippi River. On the small building's facade, the 2-century-old planks had been discolored by time and weather. The boards were a muted green and faded halfway down the wood like the residue of tears that reached the bottom of its face. The slave quarter sat on several small brick foundations with 3 unadorned wooden steps leading up to the porch and 2 entryways. The room felt fragile, like one wrong step might break a piece of history. And when you enter into these spaces, you feel that. You sit and you look, and it's just really, it's amazing. I just cannot have words to describe it, but as you sit there and you think about what slaves endured. Again, there were no windows, no doors. So the elements blew in and out. And again, you can tell that many families crammed into these small spaces and lived. On the image behind me, if you notice, to the left side of the porch are statues of children. I want you to remember those statues of children because we're going to come back to that in a minute. But these are just images of the slave quarters. Next slide, please. The next stop along the way was the jail. This was made out of iron, and of course time and weather has eroded it to what you see today. But when I walked into this space, again, I was just overcome with just pain and sorrow just to think that when a slave was punished, they were put into this space. And again, it's metal, so you can imagine in the summer, it's hot. It was hot in there when I was in there. And in the winter, sure it's cold. Again, it's nothing to protect them or from the elements. And these are, the what our people had to endure. These are some of the consequences that slaves had to endure for bad actions. Next slide, please. As you move along, you get to the next spot, which is called the Field of Angels. And the Field of Angels is a memorial that honors the 2,200 enslaved children that died in St. John the Baptist Parish. So that's the entire parish, not just the property, but the parish. Again, like I said, the record keeping that they went through for this plantation was really amazing. 2,200 kids died between the years of 1823 and 1863. Now let me say that again. 2,200 enslaved children died between 1823 and 1863. That's a period of just 40 years. Many of them died because of malnutrition, disease, and hard labor. And what I want to do, I want to read another excerpt from the book describing the image that you see behind you. At the center of the courtyard, on an elevated pillar, was a statue of a woman down on one knee. Her chest was bare, and a pair of large wings jutted out just from under her shoulder blades on her back. A heavily creased cloth was draped loosely around her midsection, falling over her legs to the ground near her feet. Her hair pulled into several thick rows of braids tugged horizontally across each side of her scalp. Her neck was smooth and curved, while her head was bent, eyes cast downward, looking at the limp body of the small child in her hands. This Field of Angels, if I can describe it to you, is about the size of the sanctuary. Around it is about a 3-foot high wall with the names of children from all over St. John the Baptist Parish who died during this time. I said earlier I could not take myself to take a picture of the names just because it was just that powerful. But as you stand in the space and you just look from a distance and see names and names and names and names, and it wraps around you. And again, I took the time to walk through and read and make that connection. It is very powerful. Next slide, please. In 1811, there was an insurrection. It was known as the German Coast Uprising. So a lot of people ask, well, why was it called the German Coast? This part of the Mississippi River was named the German Coast because it was noted for a lot of German immigrants began to settle there when they came to America. So again, hence it got the name German Coast. And on this day, on a rainy southern Louisiana evening in 1861, a slave by the name of Charles Desson, a mixed-race slave driver, led a massive armed rebellion. Composed of hundreds of people, Deslon's army advanced along the serpentine path the southern Louisiana's River Road to New Orleans, with a military discipline that surprised many of their adversaries. It is remarkable to consider that hundreds of the enslaved people who came from different countries with different native languages, different tribal affiliations, were able to organize themselves as effectively as they did. The 1811 German Coast Uprising is one of the very little known resurrections. It is said that it was even more popular than Nat Turner's rebellion. And what the goals of these slaves were doing, they actually wanted to march back to New Orleans and kill all the plantation owners along the way. They actually were successful at killing 2. They burned a lot of the properties, burned a lot of the sugarcane and rice fields, a lot of the mansions. But eventually they were met by a militia. Once the militia found or caught up with them, many of them were hanged, many of them were shot by way of firing squad. But to make an example out of them, basically what they did is they severed their heads. The part that I shared with you earlier about the heads being on stakes, this was a part of this exhibit here. And I will say it was very powerful just to stand and see this piece again of just the heads of, there was 22 men who were involved in the militia. During that time, actually what they did, when they severed the heads, they put them on stakes and lined them up along the Mississippi River. So this way, any sail ships coming in were able to see the results of any insurrection, and it sent a strong message to any slaves who thought about raising up against their masters. The leader of it, Deslon, his head is to the front. So if you see the picture on the right, he was the lead one, and so he was positioned in the front, but all of the other heads were people who were part of the insurrection with him. Very powerful. Next slide, please. As I continue to move through, you get to the final stop along the tour, and rightfully so, it is a church. This church was not part of the original plantation. It was actually built and placed there, and the reason it was placed there is because they wanted to focus on the the historical significance that religion did play in slavery. Basically, slaves were very deeply rooted in their religion, even when they were transformed over and were made to worship or accept Christianity as their religion. Religion was still a very powerful tool that the slaves always cherished. So the last stop on it was, of course, the Antioch Baptist Church. Next slide, please. Once you enter inside the Antioch Baptist Church, you see a lot of small statues or statues of children, very similar to the ones that were on the slave quarters sitting to the right of the slave house. These statues of children are scattered all throughout the plantation. And the reason they were very intentional with doing this because they really wanted to focus on and bring attention to the fact that there were a lot of children on the plantation. These statues are the Children of Whitney. They were designed specifically for the plantation by artist Woodrow Nash to add a new layer to the landscape of the plantation. There's so many misconceptions about slavery. People don't really consider the children who were brought over and the children who were born into this system. And the way to get people to let their guard down when they come here is being confronted with the reality of slavery, and the reality of slavery is child enslavement. So, as I took a seat in this church, and I will say the church was air conditioned, so it was a nice break from the hot New Orleans sun. But as you sit in the church, it's a perfect endpoint because it does give you time to reflect on what you saw, reflect on what you read, and take time to have a moment to pray. And as you sit amongst the pews with the children's statues, and these statues are lifelike. You know, each one of them is very detailed. I mean, down to their clothing, the overalls, the hats, the hair. Very, very meticulous and very specific. So it does cause you to really think really deeply. Next slide, please. Again, these are just some of the detailed statues. Again, very much lifelike. And they're all, again, scattered throughout the plantation. Places looks like children playing, children running around. Next slide, please. And on the wall is an oil painting. And you see that when you enter and you see that when you exit. But again, it just speaks to the history of the plantation and the fact that basically these children were a part of this. Next slide, please. All right. Jumping 40 miles back to the city of New Orleans is Congo Square. Many people are familiar with Congo Square. The reason I inserted this picture here is Congo Square was the trading point for many slaves. When many slaves were brought into New Orleans, they were brought to Congo Square where they were bought and sold. And Congo Square became the meeting place. A lot of Africans who came in basically were, I guess they were asked to do entertainment, so they began to sing and dance. So again, these dancing and these celebrations in Congo Square eventually would become, evolved into what would become Mardi Gras many years later. But I think Congo Square is so important because it is, again, was that starting point for a lot of Africans when they came into this country. And it was also an ending point for a lot of the families who were broken up and sold to various masters. Next slide, please. Getting back to the plantation, one of the main staples, of course, in New Orleans, like I told you, was sugarcane. As I was driving in, sugarcane fields to the left and right. But the other two things that they produced were rice and indigo. Sugarcane was the most profitable, or sugar was the most profitable. However, when I was down there, they told me the sugar could only be produced in 2 months out of the year, November and December. And if they were not able to get their crops and yield everything right, then the plantation owner would take a loss and he would not be happy. So again, slaves worked really, really hard. You know, sugarcane is a very laborious resource. So if they didn't get it right, essentially for those 2 months, they were punished. But the sugarcane was produced in what was called open kettles. And they continued to use the open kettle production way up even into the 19th century. It was invented by a free man of color called Noble Rilelu. This sugarcane, this method of producing sugarcane in these kettles was produced a better quality sugar. It was safer. However, the caveat to it, it was quite expensive, so only wealthy plantation owners could use it. But again, it was a main staple in one of their cash crops. Next slide, please. All right. There were several owners of the Whitney Plantation over its history, but I told you the main owners were the Haydels families who owned the property from 1752 to roughly about 1867, so 115 years. And then the widow of the Haydels, like I said, sold it to Bradish Johnson, who named it after his daughter. But I really want you to focus on the name Haydel. They were the main owners of this property for that 115-year period. All right. Next slide, please. I think it's really too important to note the history. This gentleman you here see, John Cummings, he was a lawyer. He's a real estate lawyer from New Orleans. And basically, he was challenged with, let me back up. He wasn't challenged. He actually bought the property for $8 million, and he was challenged with the idea of figuring out what to do with it. It was an old plastics corporation prior to the time he bought it. But what he decided to do was basically turn it into a museum to recognize the history of slavery. I want to read to you basically something from the book. His thick white beard wrapped around the bottom half of his face. His thin frame rectangular glasses sat slightly crooked, sliding down his nose when he became especially animated. His southern Louisiana inflection rose and fell slowly and symphonically. The long pauses situating themselves in the middle of each self-deprecating sentence. He was a multimillionaire engaged in answering the ongoing question of how to use his wealth. A white person who says he has come to understand in the last quarter of his life the totality and the oppression of black people had experienced. So in 1998, one of his friends gave him a call, told him that the Whitney Plantation was available. And he said he wasn't thinking of it for the historical significance. He said, but however, once they started digging and doing a deep dig and they got into the report or the history of the land, he felt it was his duty, his responsibility to do something to recognize the impact of slavery in Louisiana there. Next slide, please. Earlier I talked about the Haydale families that own property. Well, if you ever travel to New Orleans during Mardi Gras, somebody say, hey, let's go get a king cake. The most popular bakery in New Orleans is the Haydale Bakery. Now, while there are no direct connections that were ever stated between the Haydales that owned the property, the Whitney Plantation, and Haydale Bakery, I think it's very safe to assume that this is the same family. The Haydale Bakery has been in existence for 3 centuries. So, but again, the Whitney Plantation did produce a lot of sugar. And again, the Haydale Bakery is one a lot of people in New Orleans go to when they want their king cakes in and around Mardi Gras. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the plantation does an outstanding job of preserving this recorded history. And in it again were just the names of people who had our ancestors who transcended over a period of time. There's no other location in the United States that has this deep preservation of history. Next slide. I shared with you I was there in August 16th of last year. It was a powerful experience. It was a hot experience, but it was a fortunate experience. Because 2 weeks later, Hurricane Ida came through, if you remember Hurricane Ida, and destroyed part of the Whitney Plantation. Some of the slave cabins were totally destroyed, as you see in the picture. And as you see, the image on the right was from inside the Antioch Baptist Church. Part of the ceiling had collapsed in the Antioch Baptist Church. And people who were from the foundation actually, the night of the hurricane, actually stayed on property. And I read this on CNN, and they said they were actually running around in the middle of the night in the middle of a hurricane trying to put tarps over houses and preserve some of the history of the plantation. Now, the plantation did suffer a lot of damage. However, it is now back open. So that definitely speaks to the dedication of the people there and the effort to preserve this history. But I just mention this because I was so fortunate to get there and see it prior to this happening. Next slide, please. In closing, again, I just wanted to share this with you, and I encourage you all, if you are ever down in New Orleans, please take time to make that trek down the River Road, down the Mississippi River, to actually go and see the Whitney Plantation, as it is a living history, a living memorial about the sacrifices and the names and the people who